Well, hello again, everybody. This week I want to venture off track without being too much of a pun there, but I want to go backwards, if you will, and talk about the three things that people tend to get wrong, in my humble opinion, when they build a model railroad. And I want to do these in a reverse order. We'll go 3, 2, 1, like a rocket being launched, because I think I want to end on what I think is the most important thing. So the third thing, trying to do too much. Now, we're all inspired by these huge railroads that we see, the famous railroads and that sort of thing. These are shots of the gory and defeated, which inspired so many people to go into model railroading. It's like, gee, I want to build that in my family room. This is Burl Fosnight's railroad in Cornville, Arizona, one of the largest just privately owned railroads, not a club. It's just Burl. This is his big railroad with over a mile of actual track, so close to 90 miles of scaled track on a privately owned railroad. And Verl's been able to really get this whipped together. It's not finished by any stretch of the imagination, but there's whole sections of it that are. But Verl has resources in order to build this structure, and he's also hired several people who work here. That's their job, is to build this railroad. So he has staff to build the railroad. Most people aren't going to be able to do that. And so you have to have some realistic expectations, and that starts with really analyzing the resources that you do have. How much space do you have? Where are you going to put this? You're probably not going to build a custom building like Verl did. You're probably going to try to fit this in someplace in your home. And so maybe it can't be as big as you'd like it to be. Do you have friends that are going to help you build it? Financially, what's it going to cost? And keep your expectations, realistic about that. And then really figure out what you can do. If it's just you building a small railroad in your home on fairly limited resources, then really confront that. Really say, what can I do and how am I going to go about it? And keep it well within the realm of the realistic. I know I have a nasty habit of trying to put 50 pounds of fertilizer in a 10-pound bag. I think we all want to do that. It's just kind of human nature, but you have to be realistic in your goals and expectations. A gigantic railroad is going to be a lot more work than you think it's going to be. And burnout is a real issue, and I've seen a lot of railroads get basic bench work up and maybe even some trains running around on that basic bench work, and then it really doesn't go too much past that because it's just too overwhelming, and you find you get to a point where you just realize you can't do it all. This is our good friend Steve Stribble's railroad that he had for years and years in the attic of his home, and this was decades of just coming up here and messing around with this. The basic bench work came together reasonably fast, and trains started moving around on it, and then he spent the next, 25 years just kind of building structures and adding scenery and having fun with the railroad. And it turned into this massive, huge thing up here. And it was never actually what you might call finished. There were sections of it that never did get done, and then there were sections that he would sort of tear out and redo. But mostly, there's Steve, and there's Al. Mostly they were just having a lot of fun here working on this railroad, and the fact that it was never going to be completed didn't seem to be an issue. and I feel like I can speak from a position of authority here. This is my own HO scale railroad that I built back in the 80s and the 90s. And there was a gigantic plywood desert on the second floor of my house with a couple of finished sections. And this was one of those finished sections, and this was probably the one little part of the railroad that I enjoyed the most. It was the traction line that went from Salt Lake City out to the Great Salt Lake to the Salt Air Pavilion. And I got that completely dialed in for the most part. There were still missing structures and that sort of thing. But it was fun to run trains back and forth. It was just a little point-to-point, basically just a shelf railroad. And I enjoyed that more than the whole rest of the railroad. And after putting years and years into this railroad, I enjoyed building out these little sections that were finished, but I realized what a Herculean thing I'd undertaken. And so I didn't run it that much, and I just kind of worked on little individual sections and got the most enjoyment out of doing that. And then in the 90s, I discovered garden railroading, and so I thought, gee, I'm going to put in 600 feet of track out in the backyard. And while I'm working on that, I could also work on the HO railroad because, again, why can't I just do everything? I should be able to just do everything. So I built this railroad. It took 3 years to get all of this track in. And at the end of the day, just maintaining it was such a massive project. And when I did run it, even though it was all set up for train operations and that sort of thing, I would come out here and put a goose on the track and let it go around the dog bone part of the layout while I barbecued burgers. And that's pretty much all I ever did. Okay, the second item, not having a plan. And I don't just mean having a track plan, I mean having a proper plan. And so for most model railroads, that's going to be really working out your track plan and saying, this is something that I can actually build in the available space and with the available money. And this is something that I should be able to build over the next, let's say 3 years, and then starting on it. And so this becomes kind of the classic project, like, I don't know, like building your house or something. It has a beginning and a middle and an end. And again, you have kind of a time scale and you say, well, I should be able to construct this over 3-4 years or whatever. But the thing is, at the end of that, what you're hoping to have is a finished model railroad. But a lot of model railroads are more like Steve Stribble's railroad. They'll never really be finished. They're just something that you work on all of the time and say, I'll run trains when I feel like running trains, but for the most part, I just want to come in here and build stuff and add to the railroad, and it becomes this ongoing, forever project. And so a lot of people don't want to have a project with a beginning, middle, and end because, well, that has an end. And unless you're just totally into the idea of doing operations and you want to get the railroad together as quickly as possible, and then maybe have friends come over and do realistic operations on the railroad, most model railroaders want to do something that's scalable. Something where you can get some part of the railroad up and running, and even though it's kind of a completed railroad, you can say, and now I'm going to add to it. Having abandoned those other railroads 25 years ago, this is the current project, the Garage Mahal Railroad, if you've been following along on the channel. And I've tried to work that out to sort of fit my goals and my temperaments. At first, I intended to have a dog bone on the outside part of the railroad so that there would be a huge 10-foot diameter loop here at the west end and another huge 10-foot diameter loop at the east end so that I could have continuous train running on the outside part of the railroad. And after giving that a tremendous amount of thought and talking it over with Karen and so on, it's like having those two giant loops out here in the grassy area outside the garage would be a maintenance issue that's beyond belief. It would involve ducking under bench work and trying to mow lawn around all of this. And let's just keep it simple and go with a basic point-to-point railroad from the west end on the outside part of the railroad to the east end on the indoor part of the railroad. And not tackling the whole thing all at once. Just start here on the indoor part of the railroad and get this worked up, and then start at the west end and putting in the Garden Railroad part of the railroad, and get that sort of dialed in and enjoy that, and then just kind of do like the Transcontinental Railroad. Build from the west end toward the east and from the east end toward the west. And so this has been really enjoyable building, and there are two sections of the railroad that are more or less complete, the switching yard at the east end and the village and so on at the west end. So not exactly like a scalable railroad where you say, well, I'm going to build this section and then I can add on to it, but still the idea of being able to have completed sections and then just expand on that. And I think that's a pretty good strategy. And finally, the number one thing that I think people tend to get wrong when they're building a model railroad, and that's building the railroad for the wrong reasons. And therefore, even, let's dare say, building the wrong railroad. Going back to my own predilection when I was building the HO railroad, I had a vision in my mind for what I wanted to do on that HO railroad that wasn't realistic, but it was largely based, too, on a lot of other railroads that I'd seen and admired and said, gee, I want to do that, without really coming to an understanding of what it was about model railroading that I personally enjoyed. Not just admiring other people's railroads and wanting to do the same or even outdo them. I think one of the interesting things about growing older, if you will, is coming to an understanding of exactly who you are and what you enjoy doing without constantly looking around at the people around you and going, oh, I want to do that, oh, I want to do that, oh, I want to own that, oh, I want to, whatever it is, and say, this is what actually gives me enjoyment, and therefore this is what I actually want to do, without a whole lot of influence from all of these outside sources. And I think therefore you can sort of focus your attention again on that thing that gives you the most enjoyment, or those things that give you the most enjoyment, and not go off in a million directions all at once, which I still tend to do, of course. But I think I have that more under control than I ever have had previously. Our friend Steve Stribble really enjoys working at the bench and building, especially structures. But all aspects of model railroading, he loves all of that. But trying to build this massive, massive railroad almost became sort of a problem, if you will. The railroad started to own him rather than the other way around. And so a few years ago, he started tearing the whole thing apart, not because he wanted to get out of model railroading or anything, but just because he wanted to sort of focus his attention, I guess you would say, on building for enjoyment rather than building this railroad. And so he took pieces of the railroad and he's turned those into small dioramas, and he's sold the dioramas off and given them to people and that sort of thing. But he continues to build, he's just not building a railroad. And so the thing is, you have to understand what gives you enjoyment when it comes to the hobby. Do you prefer working at the bench and building things? Do you prefer building structures? Do you prefer building trains? For a lot of people, that's simply running the train, buying some locomotives and laying some track and just running trains around. And that's what gives them enjoyment. For other people, that's not something that they find enjoyable at all. And you really need to come to terms with what gives you enjoyment and why you want to be in model railroading, while separating yourself from all of these outside influences that might be making you think, oh gee, wouldn't I love to do this, wouldn't I love to do that, without really coming to an understanding of what it is about the hobby that gives you the most enjoyment. And that's going to change over time. You may move on to outdoor live steam. You may want to collect antiques. There's a whole lot of different directions that people will go in. And so remaining flexible and perhaps not diving right into a mega railroad, which you will regret doing within just a few years, or trying to build things that just frustrate you rather than give you enjoyment. Karen and I work on projects pretty much every single day. We're over at the shop working on things, different things, sometimes for the railroad, sometimes not. It doesn't bother me at all that it's taking forever. In fact, I prefer it to take forever because I enjoy the building. And sometimes I feel a little bit disappointed after I finish laying a particular section of track, because it's like, oh darn, I was really enjoying working on that, and now it's done. I'm going to have to move on to something else. And of course, I really enjoy videoing all of this, and especially editing all of that together and turning it into shows. I get a tremendous amount of enjoyment out of doing that, or I wouldn't be doing that either. So that's just another aspect of the hobby. But as the saying goes, to thine own self be true. Really understand what you enjoy about the hobby and focus on that. And I mean really focus on that, because that's what's going to give you the most enjoyment and the least amount of frustration. Anyway, just some observations after some 60 plus years of building model railroads and messing around with this stuff. I just thought I'd share these observations, especially this last observation, which I think is the most important part of any hobby. And now for the pitch. If you are not a subscriber to the channel and you have found your way over here, please hit the subscribe button. Doesn't hurt, doesn't cost anything, helps us out, and we really appreciate you doing it. And for those of you who want to push a little financial support our way, there's the join button as well, and you can join and pay a few dollars a month to be a very appreciated member of the channel. Anyway, the easy way to subscribe is by clicking on the upcoming blue subscribe button. Zoink! Right there, the subscribe button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it too boring, and Karen and I will see you here on Sunday. See you then. Bye-bye.